me that carp are worthy of my time and effort, and I'm pretty certain he'll be able to do that. Just some basics about carp behavior. What flies, tackle, and presentations we use, as well as some of the different seasons and the differences between river and creeks versus your still water carp. So I'm excited to hear what he has to say on those. Now, admittedly, I do a lot of trash talking on carp with Duggar, but I've been known to play in the mud myself. I'm a bit of a mud man. This is the truest expression of carp. I'm going to call this carp purity because in 2014 we were in a very significant drought and all of the rivers were too warm to trout fish. And being a total junkie for fishing, I called up my buddy Matt Coles and I said, man, we got to get, all the guides aren't working up in Truckee. We got to go figure something else out. And so we went carp fishing and I caught that big mama. And that's why carp were actually brought to the United States, was for food resiliency, because dams and dams and overfishing had really put native species into a huge struggle. And so carp were planted all over the United States as food resiliency back in the 1800s, and persist today and are Duggar's main prey of choice here in California. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Duggar Gudmundsson. He is the carp master. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say. And please use the chat feature, or excuse me, the question answer feature. I will pepper in those questions. I've seen the presentation, so I know where to filter them in, and then we'll handle some of the ones that don't fit in towards the end. Okay. Duggar, I give it to you.
Yes, sir. Well, to answer the question, why carp, I think you just need to look on George's smile, which is in this photo larger than any smile I've seen him with a steelhead.
Hey, look, there's some mud in my teeth, man.
But so why carp? I mean, carp are awesome. Before I met carp, I used to be a cute, innocent boy chasing traditionally cool fish like trout and char and sea run brown trout. And after we met carp, I kind of turned into a degenerate, grew a beard, a little Amish style, and started swimming with the fishes. But carp are awesome because they're 100% sight fishing. So the kick I get out of carp more than I get out of a lot of other fish is they are constantly challenging you as an angler. So you got to see the fish. They're hard fighting. They're huge. You find them in a variety of environments. They are like totally like different feeding based on different environments that you find them in. So they're constantly testing your skills as an angler. They're wild, unlike a lot of other fish you might chase. These are wild fish that grow big. That takes them a long time to grow big. So like a big 20-pound carp might be 15, 20 years old. And they're constantly challenging. And then we find them in pretty awesome places. I think a lot of the discussion around carp tends to be around urban fishing next to shopping carts or next to that ditch next to your Walmart. But we're lucky in California to have a ton of cool water, including crystal clear flats, crystal clear mountain streams that have huge carp in them. And it's hard to beat that, 100% sight fishing. So let's get started on the basics. Carp were introduced in the mid 1800s to the US before brown trout, and they were introduced to California before the striped bass. So when people have like a higher than thou attitude and about native fish,
I don't know what you're talking about.
I've never heard that before from you, George, but if you chase brown trout or striped bass or any bass species in California and then look down upon carp, that's just hypocrisy. But they're often, because they're hard to catch, and that's why I think they tend to be used as a scape fish, like a scapegoat for a lot of different water issues and fisheries issues. Whereas the reality is that carp are oftentimes not a huge impact or competition with native species, and they tend to stick to different areas, whereas like a brown trout directly impacts rainbow trout populations in California, or striped bass might inhabit the same streams as steelhead and salmon and eat them, whereas a carp might eat a clam. So often unfairly scapegoated as a problem fish.
So they're out there doing the Lord's work, huh?
They're doing the Lord's work.
Yeah.
Like these fish in the photo behind here that show you fish rising and eating dry flies off the surface in the middle of winter.
You have a word for that, though, right? There's a word for what they're doing.
Gloop. Glooping.
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 Right?
Yeah.
Glooping.
And when you see them do this, you'll understand why, because they make kind of a cloop cloop sound. But they're highly sensitive creatures. So emotionally sensitive to jokes that George makes, but they're also super sensitive to sounds, smells, flashy clothing. Don't bring a Coors Light can on the flats with you when you're chasing carp. I have done a test where I have an IPA and I have a Coors Light. You pull out the Coors Light can and you spook the whole flat. You pull out the IPA, you can drink that. They're hard fighting. And you can find them in like dry flies, nymphs, streamers. You find them in rivers. You find them in lakes. They're everywhere. They were brought over in the West along the Transcontinental Railroad to feed the workers. So really, this is America's fish. They're immigrants. They came here and they have survived successfully. And they're cool. You find them in cool places. The big.
It might be a stretch to call them America's fish.
I think they're America's fish. As an immigrant myself. So the biggest thing you need to look for when you start chasing carp is just spotting the different behaviors that carp have. So the different feeding behaviors, such as tailing, clooping, or cruising fish, and then non-feeding behaviors, which is sunning carp or jumping and breaching carp. And what a lot of people tend to focus on is they show up at a lake and they see a bunch of carp jumping. And first thing you need to know is jumping carp are not feeding. They are adjusting their air bladder, so they're either sucking air in or they're pushing air out. So carp do this manually, whereas most other fish do that automatically, which does mean that carp adjust to changes in air pressure much faster than other fish, which is why right after storm systems and pressure changes, carp can get right on the feeding, whereas other fish take a little bit of a while to kind of adjust to the air pressure. But mainly what you want to be looking for is tailing fish, clooping fish, and then lastly, like the last fish you want to chase is the cruisers. The sunning and jumping, just ignore them. And carp are kind of like, they are one of the fish that I'll tell you to leave fish to find fish. Whereas like most other species of fish, you find a group of fish, you want to stick to them. If you find carp and they're not doing the things you want them to do, go look for other ones. So starting
I'm gonna pause you just really quickly here. I just want to get a sense for, we can throw a poll out on how many people have carp fish before. So like, I'm just curious who we're talking to. Are we talking to a pile of carp lovers here, or people are carp curious, where they're at? So that screen should have popped up there. You can click the answer there. You can keep going now. Sorry.
Sounds good. So the most common kind of carp feeding behavior you'll find is tailing fish. So as you can see, this guy is casting in front of a bunch of fish. So these are all fish in the springtime feeding on the bottom. They got their tails up. So they kind of got their head down, tail up. These are generally the happiest fish you'll find in the springtime. They're generally pretty happy to eat as long as you get the fly in front of them in the right way. Oftentimes they'll have their tail out of the water like this, which makes them super easy to spot. And even if you don't see the full fish, if they have their tail out of the water, it kind of indicates which direction they're facing. But you want to be looking for tailing fish, especially starting like late March in most parts in California through kind of October, until you start getting the first kind of cold fronts coming in October, November. Then
when you're approaching a tailing fish like that, are you trying to approach it from behind, or kind of stay in a particular place, or how are you moving towards that fish?
Ideally, you want to come at them kind of from the side, because you don't, like, your presentation needs to be kind of like across the fish's like field of vision, not coming towards it. So ideally, you want to come at them from the side or have the fish kind of facing towards you. So when you make your presentation, the fly kind of pops into the view and is moving away from them. If your fly is moving towards them, you'll spook them. It's like your hamburger running right at you. It's terrifying.
And how's their eyesight? I've always heard carp have poor eyesight.
Carp have amazing eyesight up close. So they have like really good eyesight right in front of their faces. And then everything else tends to be motion based, which is kind of why, like, if you wear drab clothing and move slowly, you can get really close to the carp. It's almost like they just accept you as a part of the background. Whereas if you're moving fast or have a Coors Light can, they know what's up. But up close, they have excellent eyesight.
Beer snobs.
Yeah. But moving from the tailing fish, we'll move to the klooping fish, which are dry fly feeding fish or surface feeding carp. And in most parts, like the temperate parts of California, you'll find klooping fish throughout the wintertime, but you'll also find them in the late summer when you have algae blooms. If you have grasshoppers, big mayfly, midge hatches, carp will come feed up on the surface. And you can kind of see, well, most of what you're looking for when you find a klooping fish is like a bright orange donut breaking the surface. And they do make a klooping sound. So especially if they're klooping next to like a tree branch or something, you will hear the.
Yeah, and so klooping's just the fish rising to the surface to eat something. And I sent you the video because you left out one carp scenario. It is a cool name, but you left out one klooping scenario, which is where old Russian ladies in Golden Gate Park feed them white bread on a regular basis. And so at Spreckles Lake, if you walk by it and you're there for any meaningful amount of time, the carp will all come to you with their mouths open. And it's pretty hilarious.
Welcoming you with open mouths. But then like the next kind of like the lowest tier of feeding fish you want to be looking for is the cruising fish, which are kind of most of the time they're coming from point A to point B. If they're going anywhere faster than like walking pace, I would totally ignore them because they're not feeding. If you see them cruising, going side to side, opening their mouths, looking like feeding on stuff, a lot of the time they're feeding on like water fleas, emerging midges. They're feeding on algae blobs coming up to the surface. You can often catch those fish, but you got to be able to pick out the ones that are kind of side to side movers. They're looking for food and kind of read their body language. If they're moving fast, torpedoing, ignore them or you'll go crazy because they just will not eat your fly. But that's kind of the three main feeding behaviors I would be looking for: tailing fish, klooping fish, and then cruisers. So if you show up at the lake first thing in the morning and all you're finding is cruisers, if you keep moving and find a tailing fish, I would target the tailing fish more often than the cruisers. But if you got nothing else to work with, target the cruisers. And if you see a fish rising to the surface, what?
How often do you see the fish klooping? Is it sort of a once every now and again you see it, or is it pretty frequent where you are?
Like wintertime tends to be my main dry fly season down here on the Central Coast. So like you start, like once the water temperatures get into the 60s, we start getting the water fleas coming up into the water and the surface film, and then midge hatches happening in the afternoons. And then it's just all I'm seeing is cruising and klooping fish. And then starting in like March, February, you start getting fish feeding on the bottom, tailing. But you will also get fish that are tailing and then they lift up and eat a dry fly and then they go right back to tailing. And if you get like grasshopper events, so like during drought years, we have really good grasshoppers. So like you get a windy day, the grasshoppers blow into the lake, you'll have carp kind of porpoising in the waves eating grasshoppers. Then you get algae blooms in the summertime. And you get a little bit of an algae hatch, which is these like little algae blobs coming up all over the place. And carp are omnivores. They'll eat vegetables too. So they'll eat algae, they'll come and eat that. So you can, any time of the year, basically in California, I tend to find klooping fish. My main klooping season tends to be wintertime because it's only klooping. So moving on to kind of like the basic types of carp you'll see in California. I've ignored grass carp here because they're technically protected in California. Weird as that is. because they're mainly used for like containment of weeds in golf courses and stuff like that. But most of the types of carp you'll see on a daily basis will be the common carp, which is the most common. It's a very original name. My favorite are the ghost carp. You'll see they're kind of like a more white, almost, they're not albino, but they're kind of white gold, often have really red tails. They're super cool fish. And I would say 1 out of every 100 fish might be a ghost carp. Every now and then you run into koi. A lot of the time the koi are just like, they're goldfish or something that, or people have used them as bait, or they're letting out their like aquarium fish into the wild. And they're kind of cool to see, but they're often the most spooky fish you'll see because they know they're more visible than most. So the minute you start seeing them, they know you're there. So they're kind of cool because they're harder to catch than the other ones. And then you have mirror carp, which around me are not very common. Mirror carp genes tend to kind of breed out. So if you have common carp and a mirror carp in a lake and they interbreed, the children tend to be more common carp and then kind of breeds out over time. But they're cool fish. They kind of have like leathery kind of scale patterns on them with like scattered scales all over the place. And same kind of deal with the mirror carp and ghost carp. Ghost carp, it's like 1 out of every 100 or so carp that you see might be a mirror carp. But in some places less, some places more. And some lakes only have mirror carp.
A question from just going back to the carp behavior as a carp behavioral scientist.
Yes.
If you were to see carp holding still and facing in different directions, what mood would you find them in?
I would call that a sunning carp. So a lot of the time those fish they're sunning, or like we call it sunning, but like they're sitting right in the surface film often, or like kind of mid column, and they're digesting. Or they're just spooked, or they're kind of like just turned off. I would that's like a last case scenario fish that you would want to cast that, because most of them will just totally ignore your fly. But if they're totally motionless, and if you find them in a river and they're totally motionless, they tend to be spooked, or they're just digesting or doing something other than feeding. So I would try to find feeding fish.
And you mentioned earlier that they're vegetarian. Would it be outside the question that they'd be eating cottonwood seeds or cottonwood blooms or something like that off the surface?
No, they'll totally eat cottonwood seeds. They kind of just whatever is like the most available food to them, they tend to kind of key in on that. But I've also found, like, I've had days where there's cottonwood seeds covering the water surface and carp are klooping, and I think they're eating cottonwood seeds, and then I look a little closer and they're keying in on ballooning spiders flying across the surface. And they kind of stick in a little bit more protein, I guess, than the cottonwood seeds. But so it's just like they can eat anything, but they will key in extremely hard on one thing generally when they're feeding. So answer that question.
Yeah. Nice.
So moving on to kind of the fun stuff, which is the tactics. Move slow. So the number one thing I see people do is they think they're moving slow, but they're not moving slow. If you think you're moving slow, move slower. Like we talked about with carp, like their sense of like their vision, most of their peripheral vision is movement based. So if you just move slow and you're not wearing bright clothes, you can get up really close. You can get within a rod length of most carp if you just move super slow. But if you're moving fast, or if you think you're moving slow and you're still moving like fast enough for the carp, it's hard to describe how slow you need to go. But a lot, like some days they let you get away with more, some days they let you get away with less. So you'll kind of find out immediately once you start spooking carp. If you spook a carp, move slower. But like the number one thing you need to do when you start chasing them is move slow. As for gear, use like a 5 to 8 weight rod. In most lakes, you can get away with like a 5 or 6 weight rod because the fish should have pretty open water to run into. So you don't need to bully them away from structure. If you have a lot of structure around you, you might want to upsize the rod. So like, and you know your fish are going to be big, and you know you might have like maybe in a river and you might have current, you might want to go a little heavier on the rods. A good trick though, if a carp is running towards structure, and this kind of goes for a lot of different species of fish, but if a carp is running towards a structure that you don't want it to go into, Sometimes pulling harder is not the right move. Sometimes you just need to slack off a little bit because they're reacting to you pulling on them. So if you just give them a little bit of slack, a lot of the time they'll stop running to where they're going and they'll turn, and then you can put the pressure on them, and then you have a little bit more control. So you can often use lighter gear than you think. Fiberglass rods are excellent for carp because most of your casts, especially for tailing fish, are going to be 20, 30 feet at max. Like, you're not really making a lot of long casts. So a fiberglass rod is really good at making those short presentations, delicate presentations. And then they do a lot of tippet protection. So when you're hooking a big fish on 3X tippet, your fiberglass rod is going to absorb that shock a lot better than some graphite rods. I like a double taper line for a lot of my carp fishing, but like a delicate weight forward line works really well too. Just do not show up with like an outbound short or a shooting head where the line itself is thicker than the rod and it's making like a loud splash when you cast it. And you want like a general matching of the hatch. Carp will key in on very specific food items, but they won't count the thread wraps on your like midge pattern. They just needs to generally match whatever they're feeding on. It can be like a size or two larger than what they're feeding on, but it needs to kind of imitate what they're feeding. You can't just show up with whatever, like all around carp fly most of the time. You need to kind of know what they're feeding on. A lot of that will depend on how they're feeding. So when they're feeding on clams, they will like lift up and move between a spot, then go down, dig around, eat a clam, lift back up, and move around. If they're feeding on like aquatic nymphs and other like leeches or stuff, that like food sources that are moving, they tend to kind of root around more. So you get like mud trails. You get like carp rooting and feeding along the bottom as they go. And that'll kind of indicate to you kind of what they're feeding on, and then you can kind of go from there. If that kind of makes sense. Carp flies. You know, most of the carp I encounter in California, they tend to eat clams, leeches, damselfly, dragonfly nymphs. Those like on the surface film, they'll be eating midges, terrestrials, algae, you know, all sorts of things. I mean, people in like the UK will chum the water with bread. I would not recommend that, but they will eat. You know, those are kind of the flies you're looking for. And then crayfish and baitfish patterns. Carp will eat baitfish. Sometimes they'll follow schools of bass and they'll pick up shad that are stunned, kind of falling off the schools of bass. And they'll feed on crayfish, especially in rivers. I find them feeding on crayfish. And carp have like crushers in the back of their throat. So they can eat these like hard-shelled items like clams or crayfish. They'll suck them in and crush them and then get all the nutrients.
I caught a carp on a bait fish in Quartermatter Creek when I was striper fishing, and I think that's what they were probably doing. Is, and you know, it's brackish water, you know, salt and fresh water mix there, and I think they're chasing the bait fish that are getting messed up by the striper in there.
Yeah, carp are just like, they're excellent hunters all around. Like, they will, like, whatever is the easiest food for them to eat, they will key in on that. And then some like commercially available carp flies. If you're going out to the store and you're buying carp flies, I would recommend like John Montana's Hybrid, which is like this worm style pattern with a soft tackle and right behind it like a bead chain eye. It's a great clam imitation because it like has that worm tail that sticks up and a soft tackle that opens up like a clam. The backstabber is a great kind of all around leech pattern, dragonfly nymph pattern. The headstand, hipster doofus, these are all kind of like commercially available flies that'll match different kinds of like nymphs and aquatic insects that they're feeding on. And then dry flies, I love a Griffiths gnat because you can fish like especially in the wintertime, they're eating midge clusters. It's hard to hook a carp on anything smaller than a size 16 because the hook gape is going to be too small or you're going to bend it out. So Griffiths gnat's a great way to kind of imitate a larger cluster of midges, or if you sink it, it'll look like a cluster of water fleas. So you can sink a Griffiths gnat on like a fluorocarbon leader and fish it right under the surface film for those cruising carp. And then a parachute atom or other like parachute dry flies are great for, you know, different situations. So I like a parachute, especially when they're keying on the spiders in the surface film. But those are some commercially available flies. And then if you tie flies, the great advantage you have when you tie flies is you know the hooks are going to be good. And with carp, these fish are big. You tend to bend out a lot of hooks if you don't have great hooks on them. This is a Locomoco designed by Glenn Ueda. It's similar to the Hybrid in the sense that it has a worm tail and a soft tackle that kind of opens up. This is kind of a clam imitation. It doesn't look like a clam, but it behaves like a clam. So you drag and drop it, which is a technique we'll go into later, but it drops down to the bottom. That soft hackles opens up, and that foam tail kind of sticks up out of the bottom. And carp love this thing. This is probably the most productive carp fly out there, at least in our waters here in California. Then when you have really clear water, this is George's favorite fly.
Why do you say that?
I don't know.
What makes you say that?
It's a beautiful fly.
It's strange. It's oddly phallic.
But in clear water, sometimes they'll get really picky because they got, like we said earlier, they got excellent eyesight up close. So like sometimes you want to go more imitative, sometimes you just want to be like more generalistic in your imitations. And as you see there's a bit of foam on the tail that kind of keeps that tail sticking up off the bottom, because most, like with clams don't move. So you want to just drop that fly in their path and then not move it. So it helps to have a tail that kind of sticks up out of the bottom. Then this is just another kind of generalist imitation that kind of looks like a crayfish or a leech. I really like this style of mop fly for beginners because it makes the fly easy to see. And if you know where your fly is, you're more accurate on your presentation. So as a little tip, if you're starting off carp fishing, try to have a fly you can see, because you want to know where it's at. And this is kind of just a mix of carp flies I might use throughout the day, different weights, different kind of leech patterns, clam patterns, kind of freshwater scuds. And then the dry flies, I love a parachute or like a midge emerger with a little bit of foam kind of sticking up the top, which helps keep it right under that surface film. Because a lot of the time you'll see, much like with trout, you'll see carp feeding up in the surface, but they're not actually eating off the top. So then it really helps to have a fly right under the surface film. So you might just see the top of the head moving, not actually the mouth breaking the surface. And then just different styles of dry flies, like a CDC emerger style or parachutes. And you see these are larger than most of what you would use for trout. Carp are larger fish. And like I said, they're more generalist. Like as long as it kind of looks like what they're feeding on, they tend to like that. You don't need to size down for them. And if you really do need to size down for them, you can tie a smaller profile on a larger hook. But generally, I wouldn't go smaller than a size 16, and 16 is pushing it. Like 12 to 14 is kind of the smallest I tend to go. And then just algae blobs. These are glorified egg patterns, basically. And just the one on the right, there's kind of like a underwater photo of that kind of foamy midge that sits under the surface.
Those are pretty large midges. What size are you typically fishing there?
Like 12s, 14s.
Mm-hmm.
Like they just, as long as it, like I found that it, like as long as it kind of imitates the general size profile, or like not the size profile, but like the shape and profile of the fly, of whatever they're feeding on, and it's not outrageously oversized, it tends to make them happy. But when I first started seeing carp feeding on midges in the surface film, I just went with my regular trout, Griffith's gnat, or, in sizes like, or other midge patterns in sizes like 18 and down. And you have a really hard time getting a hook set on those big, beautiful carp lips with a tiny hook gape. And then when you do get a hook set on them, you're going to bend that hook out most of the time. So you want to try to you want to upsize most of your trout patterns if you tie flies and use stout hooks, which can be challenging on smaller flies, but that's what you got to do. So what to do with those flies is you want to present those flies to the fish. With a tailing fish, the two main presentations we tend to do is a drag and drop, which is what I use about 90+% of the time for carp, or you strip it past their face, like you let it fall to the bottom and strip. With dry flies, I really like a longer leader, and I do tend to like a long leader for most of my carp fishing because it allows you to kind of have flexibility on your presentations. You're not going to spook them with the line going over their head. But with the dry flies, you want to lead the fish. And carp, if you find them in groups feeding up top on the surface film, it's always better than a solo fish, because a solo fish is going to kind of go all over the place. If you find a group, they're kind of keep each other in line. So that makes it a little easier to lead them. If you find a solo fish and he's kind of moving all over the place, often you have to cast multiple times to try to get the right track on him. But to go in depth on the drag and drop is like the best presentation for most carp, especially when they're feeding on the bottom. So you cast ahead and past the fish. I tend to, like, general rule of thumb tends to be cast past the fish about 3 feet and about a foot in front of them. You let the fly land, and immediately as the fly lands, you lift your rod tip up. You keep that fly in the surface film. And then you keep it in the surface film until it gets to, ideally, about an inch, like 3 inches in front of them and an inch to either side. And then you drop the fly. And you just drop it and let it sit motionless on the bottom. Usually they'll pick it up as it drops down, and you'll see their head kind of go down after the fly. But what you don't want to do is you want to cast it and then you drag it and it's kind of mid-column. If the fly is coming at the carp mid-column, they'll spook. If you keep it in the surface film for some reason, they just ignore it. Or like they won't spook as much.
Why don't you just cast it an inch in front of its face?
Because usually you're using, like, if they're feeding on the bottom, you're using a heavy fly, which will make a splash. And then therefore spook the fish. And you won't get the same drop. Like if you just cast a fly and it splats down, it drops down. It has to drop a little faster than if you drag it and then just like a slow drop down. And then, like, if you're stripping the fly, you will still want to cast past the fish, but then you let it sink down to the bottom and then slowly strip it past them, which works really well if the fish are feeding on leeches, damselfly nymphs. I tend to, like, most of the carp on the Central Coast will not move for a stripped fly except late May, early June. Like when it starts getting really hot and before it's been really hot for a long time, they tend to really key on leeches and dragonfly nymphs and stuff, like skidding around the bottom. And then you can strip the fly in short strips. Most of the other time, you just want to drag it, drop it, and leave it. And then you like want to keep an eye on, like, I like to get tight to the fly without moving the fly so you're ready for the hook set. Because like as you drag it and drop it, you're going to have some slack in your line. But the drag and drop technique, that's definitely something to practice.
And are you, so you're pulling tension in to stay connected to your fly. And are you feeling the fish eat, or are you seeing the fish behavior change when it eats something? And then what do you do to set the hook? Is it a strip set? What's your process there?
So most of the time I won't feel the fish take the fly. Most of the takes are very visual. You got to see the fish eat it. They either flare their gills, you will see the fly disappear, and they can actually suck a fly from like 3 inches, 4 inches away from their face and into their mouth. So if you see that fly just disappear, or you see him actively go down on it, sometimes you can just tell if the water is muddy and you can only see the tail. You'll see the tail go from just like a side-to-side motion when they're looking for food to kind of a scooping motion as they're feeding. If you wait like for your line to twitch, or if you have an indicator, a lot of the time you'll like miss those takes. And I really try to focus on seeing the fish eat the fly, because if you're waiting to feel it, or waiting for like your visual indication of your line or an indicator to show you that the fish ate it, a lot of the time it might be just the head bumping into your line, might be the tail of another fish bumping the line, and it increases your chances of foul hooking a fish hugely. So try to focus in on seeing the fish take the fly, and you kind of read their body language if you can't see the fly. So,
and is that scooping of the tail, is that forcing their head down? Is that what they're doing? They're kind of,
no, because they'll already have their head down, but it tends to be like they're kind of looking for stuff, and then they scoop the tail when they're actually actively chewing or sucking something in. So when the minute you start seeing them, like, you know your fly's in the zone, and you see that kind of tail scoop, you kind of know that they're feeding on your fly. Sometimes you just got to take the chance.
And then when you do set the hook, is it a lift up, or is it a strip set? What are you doing there?
My rule of thumb is anything within 20 feet, just trout set as hard as you can. And another reason why fiberglass rods are great, you will not break that rod when you set the hook on. Anything further than 20 feet, I like to strip set into them, or kind of a hybrid where you strip and lift at the same time. But most of the time, you're kind of like strip setting into them if they're further out. Because it also, if you miss the fish that way, a lot of the time it'll still keep your fly in play. Whereas If you yank out a fly with a trout set from 30 feet away, that fly goes from the bottom into the surface film and spooks about 30 carp at once. So if within 20 feet, trout set. Further than 20 feet, strip set.
Cool.
And sometimes you'll find like carp are funny. Like you'll have a big carp and he'll be up close within your rod tip and you trout set on that thing and they'll kind of just look at you like as the hook sets into them and they're like, do you really want to do this? And then they'll run or break you off immediately. And like most of the time, like if you break off a fish, it's going to be on that hook set because you, especially with a big fish, you'll hook them and they'll just like snap their head to the side and you'll just snap off like that because you don't have time to like let your rod or reel take the pressure of that hook set. But.
Nice.
Moving on to surface presentations. You want to lead the fish. I like a long leader, like 15 plus feet on most of the surface presentations, because a lot of the time you'll find fish in big groups, or you want to pick out one fish from that group. You might have to cast over other fish. That's why I really like the long leader to be able to pick out specific fish. If I want a big fish or I see a ghost carp in the middle of a group of commons, I want the ghost. And a long leader just gives you a little better presentation on it. If you're fishing right under the surface film, like with the water fleas, I like to grease my leader with like a floatant and then just have a mono butt section. And then you just have like a fluorocarbon tippet section that just kind of just keeps it under the surface film. But there's nothing super fancy about the presentation itself when they're in the surface, except you just want to lead the fish. You ideally want a carp that's moving so you can cast in front of them. Oftentimes you'll see fish feeding in the surface film and they're doing this and they're staying still. So if they're doing that and you don't have any wind, it's really hard to get the fly to where the carp is feeding without spooking them. So ideally, if in that situation you want a little bit of wind, where you can cast ahead of them and let the wind kind of drift it into the fish, or just move on and find a fish that is cruising actively in surface film feeding. So
what pound tippet are you typically using on your leaders there?
About 8 pounds, so like 3x. Occasionally I'll go down to 4x in the wintertime when they're feeding on midges and stuff, and that's don't necessarily need to. Like they're not super leader shy, especially when they're tailing. You can just use like 10 pound, 12 pound. And like, especially if the water's muddy, they'll let you get away with pretty much everything when the water's muddy in terms of leaders. But in the wintertime, the water's pretty clear. They're feeding on tiny stuff. You want to be a little bit more delicate. So then I'll go to the 3 and 4x. But nothing really smaller than that, because then you'll just start breaking a lot of fish off on that hook side. Moving on to seasons.
Seasons and up. One more question for you. On the subsurface in presentation, you mentioned indicators, but it seems like you don't really like that tactic on subsurface presentations, just because it doesn't really telegraph what's going on.
Yeah, you tend to especially if you don't know what you look for. If you put an indicator, you tend to foul hook a lot more fish because you're waiting for like a visual indication, of something bumping the fly and moving that indicator. And then, like you saw in one of the photos at the start, sometimes these fish are in thick groups. So if you're drag and dropping with an indicator and you're just waiting for that to tell you what the take is, a lot of that's just like a fish bumps the line with their tail or their head or their body, and you end up with a lot of foul hooked fish. And just so I would just get in the habit of seeing the fish take it. And that's also the fun part about carp fishing, is like seeing that take. So I tend to I never use an indicator carping. I would highly recommend you don't use that, because it kind of is like a crutch, and you will end up with a lot of fish that are foul hooked. So try to stick to just seeing that fish eat it.
I think you just became a carp snob right there.
I've been a carp snob. A carp purist, George.
Carp purist.
Anyways, we'll move on to seasons. starting with winter, which is kind of what we're kind of on the tail end in California here. And winter is kind of loose around here. And I feel like in most lowland areas of California, winter is a loose term. It's where I'm at. I mean, the mornings might start off cold on the Central Coast. Like we have 20 degrees in the morning and it's below freezing, but by the afternoon, it's 70, 80 degrees, which is perfect to send pictures to my friends back in Iceland during winter because it's not that kind of weather there.
And Dave, for everybody who doesn't know you, where exactly do you live?
I live on the Central Coast of California, kind of near San Luis Obispo. So San Luis Obispo, Paso Robles, this beautiful stretch of land between Monterey and Santa Barbara. And most of the time we're fishing kind of either side of Big Sur.
Nice.
Yeah, it's terrible. But wintertime, you know, water temperature tends to be, like I said again, like winter is winter. Water temperature is like 55 degrees in the mornings and 60 in the afternoon. It's not terribly cold. But during winter, we tend to get water fleas that kind of come up to the surface film, which you don't see the rest of the year. Like not in the surface film, they're kind of spread out through the water column. I tend to get mostly surface action in the wintertime, and I see that in most lakes that I've fished, you know, throughout, you know, the lower elevation California. Rain events will lead to excellent fishing because rain just pushes a bunch of food into the water. So you have terrestrials, you'll have like plant matter, and then you'll have like all the stuff feeding on the plant matter. So if you find like debris lines are kind of what I'm looking for most of the time in the wintertime, because you'll find areas where the wind has kind of pushed all the surface stuff floating on the surface into kind of like a big wind channel. You can kind of see in this photo here, there's like a little slick line.
Mm-hmm.
And when you find that debris line, that's where you tend to find the water fleas. That's where you tend to find the midges kind of clustered up. And if you find the debris line, you kind of hunt down the debris line, eventually you'll find fish. And I tend to kind of drive around or walk around or cruise around on the boat with binoculars. You're looking for the debris lines, and then you're looking for the mouths. Eventually, you'll find something like this, which is just a gorgeous sight. Just a bunch of fish feeding the surface film. But like wintertime, you really want to focus in on finding the food, which is easy to spot in the surface. And you want to pay attention to what the wind is doing. The wind can push food from one side of the lake to the other. So you want to be on the side that's getting the wind, not the side. You don't want the wind at your back. You really want to be casting into the wind most of the time, because that's where the fish are going to line up. And sometimes it'll be, you won't find a fish all day, and then eventually you round a corner and you'll find a little pocket where like a little cove has captured all the food in the surface, and you'll just have like 300 carp feeding the surface film.
Mm.
But I think it's a pretty cool way to spend your winter cruising around. And you tend to get big fish in the wintertime. A lot of the time you get like fish you won't necessarily see on the flats because they feel more comfortable coming up into the surface, feeding, and then they'll have the safety of retreating into the deeper water when something shows up. And the funny thing about them when they're feeding up top is they tend to they'll be feeding up top like this, and a eagle, like on our lakes, we have a ton of bald eagles. They'll fly over the lake, and every time an eagle takes off, you'll just see carp coops spooking all over the place. And you can use these eagles as like a radar. So if an eagle flies over a portion of the lake and you start spooking a bunch of fish, you know that the fish are there. And I think because they have the security of retreating to the deeper water, once they get spooked, they'll come back a minute or two later and start feeding again. With some exceptions, if you are constantly casting over those fish and you spook them, they will come back less frequently or split up entirely and move over. But like birds, and like a couple days ago, I had a big kind of military plane fly over, really low flight over the lake, and it just spooked every single carp in the lake. And you could see it kind of as it moved down the lake. And then a minute or two later, you start seeing those mouths come right back up. So they're used to being afraid from above like that. So they'll like kind of spook down and then they'll come back up to feed. If you spook a fish on the flats, they're gone. But over deeper water, they tend to be a little bit more willing to come back after getting spooked. And then just, again, wintertime in California, in awesome weather is hard to beat. So starting like mid-March, it tends to be kind of around the full moon in March, everything just kind of goes nuts. And it's all centered around the spawning cycle. The springtime from like mid-late March through May, early June is prime time. And you'll find fish in various stages of spawning. So during good water years, you'll have fish spawning from like early March all the way through June, and they'll do it again in October, November. During low water years, like during the drought years, sometimes it's just like a couple days that they're spawning around on the full moon in March and April, and then you just don't see them again. But you will find fish feeding up before the spawn, you'll find fish spawning, and you'll find fish in post-spawn. And a lot of the time you'll find fish doing all these things on one flat. So you'll find like the big bellied mamas and they're feeding right before going to spawn. Then you'll have big groups of spawning fish. And carp spawn by having 1 or 2 females up front in a group, and then anywhere from like 5 to 30 smaller males right in behind them. And then what they do is they push the females into the shallows, and the males will hit the female to knock the eggs loose, and then they fertilize the eggs. And those fish are super visible, and they will not look at your fly. And a lot of people's first experience when they go out chasing carp is they know springtime is the best time of year to go. They see a bunch of fish moving around in the shallows, and they try to cast at these fish, and not a single one of them will look at it because they're busy doing other things. But during the spawn can sometimes be the best time of year to get crazy numbers of fish, because that big group of fish spawning might not be feeding. But if you know what to look for, like those fish on the periphery, they're feeding on all the stuff that the spawners have been rooting up. So they're not feeding on the eggs necessarily. They're feeding on the worms, the dragonfly, damselfly nymphs, the leeches, everything being rooted up because it's a huge commotion. And you'll hear it. Like sometimes I'll show up at the lake, I'll open my door, and I can hear the carp spawning. It's loud. But if you're only focused, oh, it's romantic, George.
Uh-huh.
But you'll see, like, it's crazy. Sometimes the lake is just covered in fish spawning. And if you don't know what to look for, it can be the most frustrating time of year for you. But if you look for the right fish and they're feeding around them, you can have 50, 60, 100 fish days. And then after the spawn, you kind of get a post-spawn period. Like with most fish, they're hungry after they've spawned. So then they're feeding up recklessly. And that's also like a great time to get like a lot of fish. But the biggest fish of the year tend to be pre-spawn, obviously because they got a big belly of eggs. They're all fit, ready to go. But springtime, absolutely the prime time to go. You know, we can get doubles of fish, and it kind of coincides with the clear water before the algae blooms in kind of early summer. And you get, also what you get is rising water levels. So you have like the rains from the winter have been bringing the lakes up, and with rising water levels is tons of new food for the carp. So the carp, like as the lakes rise, they'll be right on the shoreline feeding on everything that just got covered. So they'll have bugs, ants, everything. Sometimes you'll see the carp coming out of the water, feeding on the shoreline, and they'll back off. So they're feeding on like insects on the shoreline. And those fish are super hard to present to, except when they're backing off and moving. But springtime is crazy. Like, you know, it's a lot of newly flooded vegetation, and there's a ton of happy fish around. And like, I would say like April, May, you might have heard carp are super tough. If you know what to do in April, May, they are not very tough. You can just catch as many carp as you want, as long as you dial in that presentation. And what I would say in general with carp, the difference between 0 carp and 1 carp is huge. The difference between 1 carp and 20 carp is not that big. So like once you dial in the technique for the day and kind of follow along with their different moods, so like they might switch from clams to leeches about lunchtime, but if you follow along with what they're doing and keep that going, you can catch a ton of fish. But meanwhile, if you don't know the specific presentation, you're casting the fish, rejecting your fly all day long. It's the most frustrating time of your life. But if you're starting out chasing carp, coming up now is spring. This is the time to do it. Don't take your first carp trip in October. Don't do it in January. do it in March, April, May. And the fish are happy, healthy, fat, and beautiful. So moving on to summer, and summer around here gets super hot. Like you have, 100, 120 degree days out on the water. You want to target fish in the mornings and evenings. You tend to get a lot of algae blooms, at least in most of the lakes that I fish, and most of the lakes you see in like lowland California tend to get some sort of algae bloom. And like I talked about with the dry flies, algae blooms can be excellent dry fly opportunities. So you kind of fish those kind of eggy style blob patterns in the surface film, and you can have a lot of fun with that. But summertime, once it gets to about 11 noon, it's just miserable out there. So then often rivers and creeks are a better option. Or if you have a lake that has actively running streams into it, you might want to target the areas where those streams kind of flow into the lake because it keeps the water a little cooler and keeps the fish a little bit more active. But summertime, also, this is kind of like a river inlet in one of the lakes around here. This is the middle of June, crystal clear water, and it's cool water. So when it's 100 and something degrees outside, it's really nice to go for a swim with the fish. To catch the carp, you have to become the carp.
I always like this photo because the air bubble coming out of your left nostril makes it look like you have a nose ring.
Out of my gills, you mean?
Yeah, your gills.
So after summer, you have fish that have been in the shallows for a long time. So they have been since early March, they've been in the shallows feeding. So fall, that's the spookiest fish of the year in the lakes. So you'll have fish that are in super shallow water, just like ankle deep water, but they are super aware of everything going on. So this is time for long leaders, unweighted flies. You want to target the shallow muddy flats and gravel bars. You tend not to find fish doing as much different stuff as you do find in the springtime. Like springtime, you might find fish on gravel bars, mud flats. They'll be kind of on deeper edges, or they'll be feeding up top. In the fall, you tend to just find them on darker bottoms, especially later in the fall. You'll find them on black sand or black mud. But and then sometimes you get dry flies. So during the dry years, you get a lot of grasshoppers. I haven't seen a lot of grasshopper action on my lakes the past 3-4 years because it's been wet winters. But during the drought years, we had excellent grasshopper action late fall. But the fly choices in the fall tend to be unweighted, like an unweighted worm pattern or an unweighted kind of creature fly.
I mean, this is an extremely redeeming quality of carp because everything else fishes well in the fall, and carp are nah.
Yeah.
So
they'll make a difference. And you can have
the only thing you really do, you don't want to be doing in the fall is carp fishing apparently. So that's nice. That's nice.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. I mean, I like fishing for carp in the fall, but it's really tough. If you really want to test your skills as an angler, you go carp fishing in the fall when the lakes are dropping and the fish are being super spooky. But would not recommend it as a beginner. If it's your first time chasing carp, you will go nuts in the fall. But the fall is also just pretty. It's there's so much golden light out. It's the fish are happy. They're feeding, or they're healthy. They're stocked up again after spawning. And you do sometimes get a late fall spawn. So you get sometimes in October in the full moon, you might in a good water year, you might get fish spawning again in the fall, and that can help the fishing a little bit. But most of the time, fall is pretty tough. But yeah, moving on to, so most of what I focused on applies to lakes or still waters or really slow moving big rivers. Whereas rivers and creeks tend to fish a little, we have a lot of really trouty rivers and creeks around here that hold carp. And it's kind of an interesting problem to have because they have fast water, deep holes, and then really short flats. So they fish completely differently. But what stood out to me the first time I fished a river for carp was you show up and the fish are constantly on the move, and it looks like you spooked them. So they're kind of they might have a pool, and they'll kind of run downstream, and then they'll feed on the way upstream, and then they'll run back downstream and then feed back up. If you find a carp in a river and he's sitting still, they're not feeding, not like a trout. what I like to do when I'm fishing a river or creek is oftentimes the first time you fish it, it's good to just walk through it and spook a bunch of fish to kind of get a feel for where they're, like, how they utilize the creek. So the next time you go, you know where to like place yourself so you can kind of ambush them. So you want to set yourself up in a feeding line, wait for the carp to kind of move by you, and then you can make your cast. They're good year round because like they don't have anywhere else to go most of the time. So they'll kind of live in like a really small area of the river. They're not migrating up or down a lot. They might live in like 2, 3 pools, especially in the creeks around here, which dry up in the summertime, except for a few isolated pools. You want to fish areas like if you go on Google Maps and you're looking for a creek to fish, you want to fish around the areas that have a lot of deep pools to hold those fish over in the wintertime. No, in like the fall and summer when it's dry. But you want to look for slower moving deep water. You want to use heavier flies because you're like the fish is moving upstream while he's feeding and the current's going down. So you want to get your fly down faster. You need to lead them on a little bit more because of that, because like you're counteracting them moving up and the current moving down. And it tends to, like, rivers and creeks tend to have shorter, fatter fish. And I think it's because they're not moving around as much as they do in the lakes. Like in the lakes, they're constantly expending energy. Like they're constantly moving around to feed. In a river, they're just like kind of circulating the same pool, doing this thing. So those fish tend to be short and fat. But I love fishing a lot of the smaller creeks. You find like tiny creeks. It's almost like you're in New Zealand fishing for invasive brown trout in New Zealand, except we have carp.
It's very similar. You're right.
See, it's like, I mean, it's just like a brown trout.
The resemblance is incredible.
Oh yeah. Okay. But so that should cover a lot of the bases with carp. I mean, like lakes and rivers, they're abundant. Most places you live, especially around here, you'll have carp within 30 minutes of where you live. They're challenging, they're fun. If you want to like up your game as an angler, carp fishing is a great way to do that because you'll see what's going wrong. Like you will actively see every single fish spook when you first start fishing, and then you'll see your progress grow. They're really hard fighters, especially in the springtime when they're fat and you hook them on the flats, and they'll just take run after run after run into your backing. There's a diverse variety of tactics we use for them: dry flies, nymphs, streamers, and they kind of overtake your life. I started fishing for carp when we first moved here to the States when I was 10, and my mom dropped me off at a lake, and I had no clue what I was doing. And I saw these giant golden fish start jumping around all out of the lake, all over the place. I think it was right in the middle of spawning season. And I haven't gotten them out of my head since. I mean, I get emails from people after I take them out fishing, and like maybe on the first trip, they landed one and got super frustrated with a bunch of other fish. And then a couple days later, I get an email, and these people have been dreaming about carp lips. Like these fish will overtake your life. So proceed with caution.
Awesome day. That was great. I'm still going steelhead fishing this weekend. But I just want to follow up with a couple of questions. So just on the river situation, are you presenting your fly upstream to the fish, or are you still trying to get even with them?
So there you want to cast it upstream because the fish
Okay.
generally in rivers, unless you have a really slow current, they tend to feed as they're going up. So you want that fly to like kind of come down at them, like drop down.
And so that's like the scenario where the hamburger can run at them and they're fine with it.
Yeah, but the hamburger's like dropping down.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's like a drive-through.
And then there's a lot of questions on like specific regions and zones where people live, whether or not there's good carp fisheries in their areas.
Yes.
So you're a young Icelandic boy, you get dropped off at the lake. That's step one. As you start prospecting for carp fisheries, like what are things that you're looking for? You talked about in the river, Google Maps, deeper pools and things like that. But when you're considering lakes, like you're just on Google Maps and looking around, what sort of features are you looking for a good carp fishery?
So generally you want to find like extended shallows. So if you go on Google Maps and you're looking for like the inlet area of a lake is generally a great place to start because most lakes have an inlet, in a really shallow kind of area in the back of the lakes where there's like flats. Or if you have a cove in the back of the cove, you might have a little flat back there as it shallows out. But you'll also find, like in springtime, gravel bars. Gravel bars are huge. So if you can find big kind of, 3-4 inch gravel kind of peppered around all over the place, carp love that stuff. But in general, I would start by just looking for shallow water on lakes. Same thing with rivers. You want to start kind of at the lower end of the rivers where you have a little bit slower water, deeper pools, maybe kind of that boundary. Like a lot of rivers might have trout in the upper section, and that kind of boundary where it starts getting a little too warm for them, kind of at the bottom of the river, you'll start finding really good carp water. But then, like if you live in a city and you want to start finding carp, I mean, outflows from water treatment plants. You might have kind of sloughy, like around the bay, you have a bunch of sloughy sections that are kind of brackish, like you were talking about, where you caught your carp on bait fish.
Yeah.
Like carp can live in brackish water. They won't go in salt water, but they'll live in brackish water. So if you find those kind of sloughy sections with a little bit of fresh water, look for those. The great thing about carp is they can live everywhere. So I would, hopefully that kind of gets people started.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think if you have, my view on becoming a good angler is the more that you can engage with, something specific. So whether it's carp fishing, or for me, it's been the surf, that you can get out there on a regular basis and end up like Day here, who's like, he knows the mood that these carp are in because he's out there, he's done it for so long and has spent so much time with them. And the more you're fishing and learning the little tricks, you're going to become a better angler at any type of fishing. And so carp are extremely accessible to most of the population. And so, the process I've always taken is like, you start with a hypothesis. This looks like a good place to fish for carp. Go there, check it out, see what you see. And now seems to be a really good time to be doing that. A little bit colder temps, the water's probably a little bit clearer if there's not a lot of muddy offlow coming in. And start looking around, and don't be discouraged on day one if you don't see them. Maybe come back in the middle of the day where you have higher sun and you might be able to spot fish better versus early morning when the light's low and it's harder to see into the water. And just start having hypotheses, test them out and see what you see. And don't be discouraged by not finding fish or striking out, because you learn something. You learn that maybe they're not there. That's not a good place. And so it's something you're checking off the list and moving on to the next step. And so, that's all part of the process of becoming a good angler is engaging with that process. So yeah, don't be discouraged if you don't immediately succeed. This is not an easy thing to do. It becomes easier, but in the beginning it's challenging. So
yeah, and like spooking fish is not a bad thing. Like especially first time you go out. Like if you're walking a little creek for carp and you just like kind of sometimes like I'll just walk up like little creeks, you'll just like get in the middle of it and you walk up and you start spooking fish out of different holes and different stuff. Because most of the places that have carp, you're not worrying about another angler coming up behind you. So once you spook them, you kind of know where they kind of like to reside. So the next time you go out, you know which places to go.
Dave, one more question. So say you got a big mud going, right? Where are you going to put your fly?
Like where carp's like feeding and he's rooting up a bunch of mud.
Or maybe there's a bunch of carp feeding. Maybe there's a whole wad of carp feeding in there.
I try to just like, if you can see the tail, immediately it'll like give you a good indication of like where that fish is facing. And you tend carp are generally, they don't get longer than like 35 to 40 inches. So like, I mean, like that's a huge carp. So like, I mean, anything from like 30 inches is kind of your go-to from where you see the tail to where you want your fly to land for most carp. So you can kind of visualize, you see that tail, you see the angle that the tail's at, and you kind of know where the head's at. So if you see a single fish doing that and mudding, he's a good target. A lot of the time what you'll see is just out of like your visibility zone, you'll have like a belt of mudding carp and you'll just see the mud constantly going up. And what I've seen a lot of people do is they'll put an indicator right into the mud, and then, like I said, like a lot of the time you'll tend to kind of foul hook those fish. So I would try to stick to those fish that you can see some part of the body, like especially the tail, or just move. If you like, I would always like, if you have a better option, if you can't see the full fish, move. Like, find a happy.
The other thing too is if you have like wind or current, right, pushing the mud in a certain direction, like trying to get to the leading edge of where that mud is starting, because that's where the fish is kicking up the mud,
Yeah.
and probably in the direction they're working too.
Yeah, and you'll often see, like, you might have like a mud plume, and you might have like a little dirtier patch of mud, which is like fresher mud being pushed up. That's where the head's at, or the gills will push mud out of the way, and it'll kind of give you a visual indication of, like, you can kind of visualize what the fish is doing. And if you can do that, you can drop your fly in, and then, I mean, then it's super helpful if you can't really see the whole fish. You can do short little strips, especially if it's just like one or two fish, and you kind of see the mud moving. And sometimes you'll see bubbles coming out of the mud that kind of give you an indication of that's where the head is in. Like, that's bubbles coming out of their gills. So if you see a bubble trail coming out of a mud plume, that's where you know the carp is. And if you watch that bubble trail and it's moving, you kind of get an indication of where they're heading. And then you can cast like a leech in front of that and slow strip it. And if you see that mud move, if you're stripping it, sometimes you'll feel the take. That would be kind of the best option in that scenario.
Yeah, I like it. Well, I always say there's no shortcuts in fishing, which is kind of the wonderful thing about it. But if there was a shortcut, one of the best things you could do would be to go fishing with a person who knows what they're doing. And so, Day, you take people fishing for a living, both here and in Iceland. Here's a lot cheaper than Iceland, from what I understand.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. So how do people book you?
So if you scan the QR code on the screen here, it'll take you to my link tree, which is just a bunch of different links to my website. My website is daggerflyfishing.com. There's a little form on there. You can contact me or just shoot me an email on daggergood@gmail.com. But I would take a picture or use that QR code.
So, I mean, my recommendation, you take your husband or wife to Paso Robles, do a little wine country hangout, maybe Pismo Beach, and then spend a day with Day and do a little carp fishing.
Get the true California gold.
Or better yet, fly to Iceland and fish for one of the greatest game fish of all time, the Atlantic salmon.
Or both.
Or both, yeah.
Hone your skills on carp, and then you can catch any Atlantic salmon.
Awesome. Well, it's fantastic. Really appreciate you divulging all that information with everybody. And I hope some people here take the opportunity to book with you and go down and fish. I know when I'm down visiting my in-laws, I'm going to make a point of getting out with you. So
yeah, go cruise around in the mud.
Yeah, be mud men together.
Oh yeah.
Good deal. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thank you, Tracy, for putting this together and doing all the hard work on organizing everything. And we really appreciate you. And I hope everybody takes the opportunity to join us at the Fly Fishing Film Tours. The links are on the website. We have another webinar where we're talking San Diego with Conway Bowman, who's a wealth of information as well. And if you're at the Pleasanton Fly Fishing Show, stop by the California Fly Fisher booth. I'll be next door at the Lost Coast Outfitters booth. We have beer. I don't know if Tracy's bringing beer. Are you bringing beer, Tracy?
I usually have Bloody Marys and donuts, and coffee.
All right, nice. All right,
got you going throughout the day. Keep you sugared up.
Fantastic.
Well, and Dave's going to be right across from us, right? I was Matt. Yeah.
Where will you be?
Iceland Outfitters.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I'll be stealing Bloody Mary.
We're gonna be the coolest aisle there. Awesome.
Cool.
Very good. I will drink Coors Lights to try and scare Day away. Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks. Bye.